Thank you for coming and welcome to the legislative preview for 2018 for Gall. I am the Vice President this year of Public Affairs. My name is Victoria Keeley. I think we have a really great event, great speakers this year, and we have some people who are participating remotely, virtually. So the way we'll work it is our speakers will have come up and give their presentations, and then we'll give people a chance to ask questions if they want. We do have 8 speakers scheduled. I think everybody is here, which is awesome. Thank you for coming out in this weather. I also would like to take a moment and introduce our president, Cheryl Legree. Say hi. And my co-chairs, Megan McCullough and Debbie Ann Rickman. Thank you for all of your assistance. And so without any further ado, I will get started and introduce our first speaker. And if I butcher your name, I'm sorry. The first speaker is Fatme Baidoun. Okay. She's with the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence. She's their public policy analyst, implementing and managing public policy programs, including formulating policy positions, and she also researches, analyzes, and monitors public policy issues affecting domestic violence survivors and their children. She is a first-generation Lebanese American who grew up between Beirut, Lebanon, and Dearborn, Michigan. I'm going to let you speak for the rest, so please welcome her.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much to Gall for having the GCADV out here, and thank you so much for allowing the space for our legislative agenda to be represented. So I know that last year GCADV also presented here as well, and we will be pursuing the same legislation because last year there was not a lot of movement. And so it was HB 541, which was about domestic violence and firearms. And what this legislation essentially does is we want to codify into state law the federal firearms prohibitions for domestic violence perpetrators who have been convicted of family violence-related misdemeanors and who are subjected to a final family violence protective order. And hopefully, depending on how the session goes, we want to do some type of formal firearm removal as well. This is something that is still up in the air. We're still working through a lot of different things, but it is something that will be a big collaboration with other organizations, and it's something that we need in Georgia, and it's something that I really hope that we could spread awareness about. If we do officially take it up in the first year, there may be something that we do in the next year, but it is an issue that we're going to continue to pursue. So that is our proactive legislation that we would be doing as the coalition. Another two pieces of legislation that we would be supporting are actually speakers that are going to be talking about this. After me, the child abuse registry definition, as well as forced child marriage, increasing the age for marriage to 17 with no exceptions. So I will let them speak about that. I did want to just shout out of our 20th lobby day that will be coming up. It's the Stop Violence Against Women's Day. And we haven't finalized the date, but hopefully it will be done sometime in the first 2 weeks of February, so look out for that. And this is a huge collaboration with the Georgia Network Against Sexual Assault, as well as the Commission on Family Violence and Raksha Inc. and Kamanar Latino. So it's a great event, and I hope everyone who is able to attend can come and lobby and continue all of this. And yeah, I can take any questions right now. Thank you. Alyssa?
Real quick, I just want to hear a bit more about the formal firearm removal. I know
Yes.
you said it's kind of a slow process, but what does that look like as far as brainstorming at this point? What are y'all envisioning for that?
Okay, so the question was, what will the firearm removal mechanism look like? And essentially, it's going to be those who are prohibited from using the firearms, they're going to have to relinquish their firearms to federally licensed firearms dealers. So that's what the mechanism is going to look like, potentially. And the language changes, as does everything in policy. So how it will be removed and to who, that may change as well. And the removal component may not even be in, but it's something that we want to push towards. So thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
So I have to say that I had not heard about forced child marriages until you brought that up.
Mm-hmm.
That's awful. Is that something that happens a lot in the state of Georgia?
So it's something. Thank you for so the question was, does forced child marriage happen in the state of Georgia and doesn't happen oftenly? The research is being done, and so we want to find out if it does happen and how often it does happen. But this is a initiative that's being brought by Tahirih Justice Center, and it's something that they've been seeking collaborations from a bunch of stakeholders, including folks in this room. So to be determined. Yes. Help. Definitely need to redefine how people view it, and that it is public safety, and it is a public safety issue, and it's not just about firearms, but that it's something that's going to help every single Georgian in the state. And so when we focus it on like just firearms, then it takes away the actual purpose of it. And so I think uplifting the messaging that this is a public safety issue is a way that you guys can all support it as well, and not call it the gun bill. Yes.
Well, and also, isn't it true that the majority of these mass killers that we have, almost all of them have a previous
History. Yeah, so the question was, a lot of the mass shootings, the ones who have perpetrated those, they've had a history of domestic violence and have been convicted, and that is true. There's actually a lot of research that backs that up as well. And it's part of our push, is showing that relationship. Thank you. Yes, Megan?
So you mentioned that you're trying to like reframe this
Mm-hmm.
about guns, and I myself have been guilty of referring to this as like the domestic violence
Gun bill.
So what would you like me to call it instead of that?
So we don't have a formal name, but if we could start calling it the public safety bill, and I know that's super broad, but it's a start. Thank you. Yes. We still haven't found a sponsor, and there's still not a bill number, but we will keep you guys updated for sure. 541. The question was, what was the bill number last year? Oh.
I just want to ask, where can people go to sign up to be on your mailing list?
Yes.
For more information?
Yeah, so the question was, if you would like more information, including getting all of our action alerts, you can email me, and I will leave my business cards. But for the folks at home, it's going to be fbaidon@gcadv.org. So feel free to email me for any questions, and I'd be more than happy to talk through anything. Any other questions? Awesome. Thank you so much for having me, and take care. Have a good night.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Megan Gordon. She is from the Feminist Women's Health Center, which is near and dear to my heart because when I was a poor, starving student, that's where I went to get all of my health care. Megan is a Georgia native who loves her home state and knows it can be better. She received her bachelor's degree from Warren Wilson College in North Carolina and returned to Georgia to attend law school at Emory University. You are now serving as the public affairs coordinator and lobbyist at the Feminist Women's Health Center, fighting for better laws and helping other Georgians discover their power to do the same. So I'm going to let you take over. Thank you.
Thank you, and hello, friends here and friends on the internet. So my name is Megan. I work at Feminist Women's Health Center. We are a reproductive justice center nonprofit that's been in Atlanta for more than 40 years now. We have a clinic where we provide comprehensive gynecological care, including abortion care. We also do a lot of community education and outreach work, lots of sex education, lots of volunteer opportunities. We have a Lifting Latinx Voices initiative where we work within that community to overcome the health disparities created by racism and immigration status related barriers, and to provide sex education in a way that is culturally appropriate. So that's just a little bit about us and what we do. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about our agenda. So for obvious reasons, because we are an abortion provider in Georgia, we have a relatively limited progressive agenda, because I like to leave my capacity open to do a lot of defense, because there's always going to be something. So our only proactive bill that we have this year is a bill that I presented before this group last year. It's called the Whole Women's Health Act. It is designed to build off of the 2016 Whole Women's Health Supreme Court decision, which some of you lovely legal nerds in this room may know about. The very SparkNotes version is that the Supreme Court said that if we are going to put up barriers to abortion access, they have to have actual provable health benefits for patients. So our bill would build off of that by repealing the Women's Right to Know Act, which does not have actual provable health benefits for patients. That is a 24-hour waiting period before folks can get an abortion, and they have to listen to a state-mandated script that research from earlier this year actually found that the script is 25% inaccurate, as assessed by fetal development experts who had no idea it was an abortion thing. They just read the booklet and were this is false. But I'm rambling as I do, and I get nerdy and excited about things. So that is the Whole Women's Health Act, which we're going to be working on. We're also, because reproductive justice is a really intersectional framework, I also serve in a lot of committees and coalitions, and will be supporting a whole lot of different legislative efforts that are going on throughout the session, including a redistricting reform bill to try to stop gerrymandering in the state of Georgia. Does everyone here know what gerrymandering is? I'm seeing some nods. Cool. Short version, for those who don't, if anyone watching at home cannot be nodding at me right now. It's when politicians pick their districts to help them stay in power, instead of people getting to vote for their elected officials. Both parties have been really guilty of this in the past, so we're trying to bring forward nonpartisan legislation to be okay, can we all just stop and have actual districts that make sense and serve people's communities? We're also on a coalition that's pushing forward a Dignity for Incarcerated Women Act, dealing with the ways that pregnant incarcerated women are treated, everything from being shackled while they are in labor to being shackled during transport, at the ankles. If you are pregnant and your center of gravity is off, that is not safe. And folks have actually fallen and had miscarriages as a result of that. So working on anti-shackling, basic things oh, you must be given 3 meals a day because you are eating for 2 people. It's clean underwear, menstrual hygiene projects. It is truly appalling the way that everyone who's incarcerated is treated, but especially when you're looking at giving folks the resources they need to have a healthy pregnancy. We're trying to move forward legislation to help with that as well, as part of a very, very large coalition of folks who've been working a long time on this. We also are supporting Medicaid expansion and throwing our support behind our friend Fatme with the public safety bill. Now that I will accurately call it that way. And we'll be around the Capitol supporting a lot of our friends with the various efforts that move forward throughout the session. In terms of just what we are expecting, we still don't know who the governor is going to be, so who knows what's going to happen next year. We know that no matter what, we're going to be seeing healthcare reform legislation, right? Of course, Stacey Abrams is very Medicaid expansion centric, but Brian Kemp also knows that our rural healthcare communities are in a crisis. Did y'all know that only half of Georgia counties have an OBGYN in them? Yeah. So we have the worst maternal mortality rate in the country. I think we're sixth worst for infant mortality. So all of our sexual health rankings are a disaster, to be honest. So, but we know we're going to be seeing something around access to healthcare, access to rural healthcare. I know regardless of who is governor, we know we're still going to have a largely conservative General Assembly. And we know that a lot of states have been passing more and more conservative anti-abortion bills with the goal of getting an opportunity to relitigate Roe v. Wade. So we're anticipating more anti-abortion bills regardless of who is governor. We're also anticipating lots and lots of anti-immigrant bills. We've been just seeing a slew of anti-immigrant bills for the last 2 years in the legislative session. My sort of running joke is that our clinic's saving grace for the last few years is that right now our General Assembly is more racist than they are sexist. So we've been spending a lot of time helping out our friends on the immigration justice side of things, because immigration justice is also a reproductive justice issue. If your family is torn apart, like you can't have a strong family. You can't determine your lives and all of that. So we're also leaving open a lot of capacity for that. And I'm sure after the absolute chaos that was Election Day in many precincts, we will be seeing a slew of election rights and election-related legislation on both sides of the session. So keep an eye out for that stuff, too. Anyone have any questions? Yes.
You mentioned, the shortage of OBGYN in the world, and of course we know that's because of the high price of malpractice insurance, because of the fear of litigation. What can be done about that, and are we seeing a way that nurse practitioners, midwives, is that a way to go to hopefully alleviate some of that issue?
Okay. So first I'm going to repeat the question, both for friends on the interwebs who can't hear you, but also to make sure that I'm clear. So the question is that part of the reason we have such a terrible shortage of OBGYNs is because of the high cost of malpractice insurance. And so what are we seeing around that, if anything? Is there an opportunity for advanced practice registered nurses, midwives, et cetera, to plug that gap? Is that a correct summary of your question? Fabulous. So we have been seeing, there was a big push last year, I don't remember if it was from the year before too, but to increase nursing scope of practice for advanced practice registered nurses who are trained to be able to do things like basic care for people with healthy pregnancies, but the state does not allow them to practice up to the full scope of their training. So there've been huge fights about that at the Capitol last year, and I'm sure it's going to keep going. So yes, yes, we still we have nurse midwives in the state who are also sort of part of that scope of practice fight, if I recall correctly. There's also what are known as lay midwives, who are people who are not nurses but are trained as midwives, sort of in the very traditional history of midwives. If you look back to just apprenticeships and women training each other for centuries and centuries before we even had doctors, they're not legal in the state of Georgia. So that I don't anticipate going anywhere, but we're seeing more push for APRNs, and other sort of incentives have been thrown around to potentially get more doctors and stuff to move into rural Georgia. Though I would also add, I was doing some research on this for another presentation recently, and I came across a terrifying article talking about how we as a country and a state are on a trajectory to have an even more severe shortage of OBGYNs because so many of them are aging out and getting ready to retire, but our population has grown, but our like stock of folks who are in the pipeline to become OBGYNs are not. So like if you have a friend who wants to be a doctor, like a little college friend, just encourage them to be an OBGYN or something, or talk to your legislators about how we need to get proactive instead of waiting until the shortage is even worse and then panicking about how to pass legislation to fix it, which is what the General Assembly likes to do. Yes.
Well, and part of that problem is also this litigation. When you don't have rural hospitals, there's no place for people to deliver babies. So if you don't fix that problem, you can't even address.
Exactly.
If you have nurse practitioners, they're going to want to deliver in a hospital setting. You don't have a hospital.
Exactly. I could be misremembering the numbers, but I believe something like 20 birthing hospitals have closed since the mid-90s. I don't get mad at me if I'm wrong about that exact number, but you're absolutely right. Like part of the problem is that there's nowhere for people to do deliveries anyway. And research has actually found that for every 15 minutes someone has to drive to get to their like healthcare provider for their birthing practice, that has really detrimental impacts on their likelihood of preterm labor, low infant birth weight, things like that. Not because of the actual drive time, but because of what that says about their access to care. Any other questions? Yes.
From our friends on the internet, they have asked, is there a likely sponsor for the shackled birth bill?
It's in the works. I don't know how much I am allowed to say about that yet, but conversations are being had. So yes, that will be happening. Any other questions? Oh. Yes. Oh, right. And since no one on the internet could hear you ask that question, the question was, is there a sponsor for this? Oh, right. Because the question was asked online. Sorry, y'all. I'm trying a little hard. And yes, Gall will be considering throwing your support behind this at your board meeting tomorrow. So thanks, friends. Any other questions? Fabulous. Thank you for your time, y'all.
Excellent. Next, we have Madeline Simmons. I should be able to pronounce that. She's joining us today as a representative of the Georgia Trial Lawyers Association. Her day job is an equity partner in Morgan & Morgan's Atlanta office, representing individuals who have been injured due to the negligence of others. She's another Georgia State grad. She's native to Southern California, and was vice president of the Student Trial Lawyers Association, pro bono editor for the GSU student newspaper, law student newspaper, and competed as a student advocate in mock trial competitions around the country. So, Madeline, come on up.
Thank you. And clearly I need to update my bio on our website since it's all about law school and I've been practicing for 8 years now. But thank you very much for having me. I always enjoy speaking at this event, and I really appreciate Gall putting on this event since I think it's really interesting to hear what some of these great groups are doing and are planning to do throughout the legislative session. I also appreciate you all including GTLA because a big part of us protecting our clients' rights is making sure that there aren't laws that are trying to be an assault on our plaintiffs' and clients' rights. So I appreciate being here, and thank you again for having me. So it's interesting when we meet as GTLA to talk about what to expect for the upcoming session, which we usually do this time of year. A lot of times we're looking at, do we have proactive measures, kind of like we've heard others talk about, and are we going to be on the defensive? And we always know the answer to the latter. We're always going to be on the defensive. just because there's always different groups that are trying to limit people's rights to a jury trial and all different kinds of things that we're passionate about. However, with this upcoming session, what we talked about is that it's going to be a little bit different and unusual this session because we're going to have a new governor and a new lieutenant governor and 38 new legislators and the beginning of a new 2-year term. So the first month of the session is them going to be hiring secretaries and figuring out what the bathroom is. And then we see the rest of the session being every new person, wanting to bring their bright idea to the floor and trying to get everything under the sun out there and passed. So I don't think that there's going to be a lot done, actually, as far as bills and things like that are passed, because a lot of the session is going to be just the new folks figuring things out, which I respect all of our legislators and our governor and our lieutenant governor, and I don't mean that as anything bad towards them. It's just new for a lot of them. So I think that not a lot is going to get done. However, with that, we always want to be looking at what we need to be aware of. And, we do often see the same things come up that we have to be on the defensive about. And I'll give a couple things that we always watch for because they seem to pop up every couple years, if not every year. One of them is legislation to eliminate what we hear our opponents call phantom damages. So I'll kind of explain what that means. When a person is injured, let's say in a car wreck, and they have a neck surgery, for example, and maybe physical therapy, and they lose some time from work and whatever else, when we take that case to trial, the plaintiff has the burden of proof, and the jury sees their medical bills, their medical records. They usually hear from doctors, and then they get to make a determination regarding a verdict or no verdict at all, but they get that determination. When we show them the medical bills, they get to see what those medical bills are. They get the invoices, the billing statements, that goes back into evidence with them. The medical records go back into the jury room with them as well. There has been, through the years, folks that have wanted to bring bills through the legislature that would make it so that the jury would only get to see what, say, Medicare, for example, paid on the bill. So if you're a juror and you're sitting there and you hear, wow, this person had a $200,000 neck surgery, that sounds very serious and it sounds like that person was very injured. If you get to hear, wow, this person had a $1,200 neck surgery, you're thinking, well, that maybe wasn't that bad. The doctor doesn't sound like they charged very much, and maybe it wasn't very complicated and it didn't take a surgeon or whatever else. So they make all kinds of assumptions if they're not getting to hear what the sticker price was of the bill. So that's something that we watch for because we want the jury to be able to see the full picture of what this person went through. And if it was a very complicated medical procedure, we want the jury to be able to see that and have the evidence of that. Another thing that we've kind of heard that might be coming down the pipeline is creating a process for requiring pre-suit notice of intent to sue and pre-suit discovery in medical malpractice cases. One thing that we see a lot as plaintiffs' attorneys, at least it appears to us, that the other side is always trying to delay the case and delay that day in court and delay that 2 or 3 weeks in front of the jury. So already there are a lot of things that you have to do to be able to bring a medical malpractice case in Georgia. So if there's a whole kind of pre-suit discovery period before you file the suit, that you then have your discovery period that always gets extended for whatever reason, and then your expert can't come and their expert can't come and that gets extended. It just, again, delays your client's right to be able to get in front of a jury and ask for some justice for what they had to go through. So anything that's going to delay our client's right to get in front of a jury, we want to be watching for. And kind of on that same vein, this has come up year after year after year, is forced arbitration in nursing home cases. So right now, if you go, check your mother-in-law into a nursing home, there could be, when you're signing in the paperwork, an arbitration provision saying, if we decide to not change her dressings and she gets bed sores and we never tend to her and whatever else, we're completely negligent as a nursing home. We get to pick where you get to bring the claim, and it gets to be in front of a panel of people that we get to pick, and have an arbitration rather than a jury. So we always feel like it's important for folks to have their right to a jury trial. Now, of course, private places can contract with whatever they want, but there are folks that are always trying to bring legislation saying that should be forced arbitration, that should be mandatory for nursing homes to do, and that folks should not be able to say, no, I don't want to have an arbitration in Alaska for my sick mom in Georgia with a panel of your peers deciding whether or not your other peers were negligent. I would like my day in court. So we're always watching that as well. So those are kind of the things that we often see pop up. Like I said, we don't see that a lot is probably going to happen during this session, but you never know. What I always recommend to people is to get to know your legislator and be a resource, especially if you're a lawyer. I try to get to know my legislators and say, look, if I can ever help research something for you or look up some case law for you on something that comes across your desk, then they kind of get to know you on a personal level and know that you're there to help out, because I've never been a legislator, but I assume it's a pretty tough job when you're balancing whatever your normal job is, and then you're having to be in the session every day of session. If you can have some people be a resource for you, I think that can be very helpful. And I always like to hear when we get new lawyer legislators in the legislature, because it's great to have lawyer legislators, because then we're going to have laws that you would hope would be written better and maybe not challenged as much and constitutionally void or whatever it might be. So we really appreciate what every single person does in the legislature, and I always think it's important, if you can, get to know your legislators to do that. So that's all I have for y'all. Any questions? Yes. Yeah.
So it appears that more seat slips are flipped from red to blue than were anticipated with this election. Do you think that there will be any change as far as legislation or approach to legislation coming up this year, in anticipation of a greater concern among our legislators about what could happen in another 2 years? Does that make sense?
It does. And so the question is, because there have been some more flipped seats from red to blue, do we anticipate that will affect what happens this session and or the sessions to come? Is that kind of an accurate?
Right, because obviously the demographics of Georgia are changing, and this may continue to be a trend.
Right. No. And that was actually a question that I had for our legislative team. I was kind of curious about that. And I kind of got the answer of this session, again, because there's so many new people and all of the new things going on, don't know that it's going to make much of a difference for this session. But I think it's certainly something to watch for sessions to come. We still are, like I think you mentioned, a conservative group down at the Capitol. And so, I don't know that because there were so many flip seats that we're going to see that much of a difference yet, but certainly it's, trending that way to have that many blue seats, especially in, Metro Atlanta and some of the suburbs of Atlanta flip. So.
If I may just add something to that, I would be willing to bet a significant amount of money that we will see more gerrymandering. Because even though every 10 years they redraw the district, they actually every session go in and tweak some lines here or there to protect incumbents. And so because we're seeing the demographic changes and the votes really threatening the power of folks the incumbents who have been representing metro areas for a long time, I anticipate them tweaking districts to make it easier for folks to win in 2020.
And I'll repeat for what you said for the viewers at home that, because of this, we likely will be seeing more gerrymandering from the folks that are used to being in power, that now maybe that's being diminished a little bit by flipping some seats.
Well, they're redrawing the lines in 2020, actually.
they do intern district shifts like almost every year too. They have the power to go in and do that, like not redraw the whole maps, but like here and there and.
And as far as the Senate goes, while the state Senate, they kept it from being a super majority, but they're still a majority.
Sure. Yeah, it just seems interesting to me. I just wonder if more of them are a little bit more worried about their seats than maybe they have been, and that might impact how they look at some of this legislation and how it will impact them in the next elections. Because we will obviously be watching very closely.
Right. No, absolutely. And what she had added is that they're going to be redrawing the lines in 2020, and then that we all kind of have the question of whether or not more Republicans are going to be worried about being able to keep their seats if they're seeing their colleagues that have had their seats for quite some time, be flipped. So, yes.
So you have, I know GTLA is a statewide organization. Do you have lawyers throughout the state that are working to get to know their legislators and help with that research? Because it's an interesting idea to me, and I think it's important.
Yes, it's a great question. So the question was, GTLA is a statewide organization. Therefore, do we have lawyers in all areas of the state that are working to get to know their legislators and be a resource? And the answer to your question is 100% yes. We think it's really important for all of our members. We always encourage our members that pretty much every time we get together to get to know their legislator and be a resource for them. If your legislator is a lawyer, they likely know how to get on Westlaw or LexisNexis or whatever else, but they may not have time. And if your legislator is not a lawyer, they may not have access to that. So being able to say, oh, this came across your desk and you're kind of wondering what this all means, let me do a little bit of research for you, I think is very valuable. And then when there's something that you would like to talk to them that's very important to you, you're not just a stranger coming to them. You're saying, hey, remember me? I helped you on these 3 different things. This is something that I'd really like to talk to you about. It's very important to me. And it makes it so you don't look as biased, I guess, coming to them saying, I only want to come to you when I need your help, but I want to be a resource for you even when it has nothing to do with me and doesn't benefit me. Because like I said, I think it's probably a very tough job being a legislator and trying to, as a lawyer, have your own practice on the side or do whatever your day job is and feel like you're doing a good job at everything. I feel like it's probably like being, a mom and a lawyer. It's hard to ever feel like you're doing everything that you need to be doing. So if we can help each other out in any aspect, that's always a good thing. So, all right. Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate you having me.
Thank you, Madeline. That was great. We always hear like a good way to get influence, well, not influence, but a good way to get to know your legislator is, to donate. For people who maybe have more time than money, that's a great suggestion. I like that. All right, moving along, our next speaker is Alyssa Green from Georgians for a Healthy Future. She is the Outreach and Education Manager, where she engages consumers and communities in conversation about how health policy impacts their lives and provides tools and resources to help them engage in the health policy making process. She also provides strategic direction for Georgians for a Healthy Future's outreach campaigns in support of policy change. Alyssa?
Hi, folks. Again, my name is Alyssa. Thank you for having me here today. I'm at Georgians for a Healthy Future, and we're a consumer health advocacy organization. We'll be working on a few different issues for the upcoming session. To start with, a few folks before me have mentioned Medicaid expansion, and that is one of our longstanding issues and one that will be working on for the upcoming session as well. So right now in the state of Georgia, although we've hit an all-time low uninsured rate, about 12.9%, that's still one of the highest in the country, and that is large in part due to Georgia's refusal to expand the Medicaid eligibility requirements. So this happens because the governor, along with the legislature, has not come together to expand Medicaid eligibility for folks in Georgia, and that leaves about 240,000 people around the state without coverage who could otherwise have coverage if we expanded Medicaid. So we'll be working diligently to back any legislation that's going to result in Medicaid expansion here for Georgians. Along those lines, we'll also be working to set standards for equitable coverage of mental health and substance use services. So under the 2008 Parity Act, health plans are actually required to provide behavioral health services just the same as they would physical health services. But we know this only works if these plans are implemented well, consumers and providers both understand how it works, and if there's oversight. So at GHF, we're going to be working to make sure that there's standards and oversight procedures to make sure that Georgia consumers are getting those mental health and substance use services that they're actually entitled to under law. Along the lines of substance use disorder, we're going to be working to prevent nicotine and other addiction by young Georgians. So most of you probably know that Georgia has one of the lowest tobacco tax rates in the country at 37 cents per pack. And this allows an increased accessibility to youth here in our state, more so than other states around the country. And so what we're going to be backing is legislation that would increase the tobacco tax to at least $1. And by increasing this tax, that's going to decrease the burden of chronic disease and also decrease the rate at which young people here in Georgia suffer from addiction and substance abuse. And finally, we're going to be working a lot with our partner organizations to address social determinants of health. So we know at GHF that if folks don't have access to transportation, education, affordable and safe housing, that's going to make it increasingly difficult to navigate the healthcare system. And we know that by working with other partner organizations who are invested in these issues, we can create healthier communities and thus increase individual health. So those are a few of the issues that we're going to be working on this legislative session. I also brought some handouts about the Medicaid program. I know that it's kind of a complicated program, and we have resources to help folks understand that, as well as prevention and thinking about access to health insurance. So if y'all have any questions about Medicaid expansion or anything else I mentioned, I'd be happy to speak a little to that as well. Megan, yes.
So I'm forgetting which state it was, you probably know, but there was some state that had on their ballot this last week to fund their Medicaid expansion by increasing the tobacco tax.
Montana.
Yes.
Yeah.
So they, the tobacco companies put millions and millions and millions of dollars into stopping that. And so I'm wondering just if that has shifted your calculus at all. Like what have you learned from that, and how are you doing it?
Well, I think what we talked a bit about this past week after the election results is that tobacco companies are seeing it as a threat and are kind of sinking. They spent $17 million in Montana alone on that initiative. So, and I don't think that we've seen that much money sunk into these kind of election results before. So I think that moving forward, at the very least, we can be positive about maybe some changes in the future, since there's seems to be some frustration there from tobacco companies, for sure. Anything else? No? Okay. Oh, that's okay.
What are the odds of that, some success in the legislature, increasing tobacco tax?
Yeah, the odds of increasing the tobacco tax in the legislature, especially with the shifting dynamics and not really sure how this session is going to go. It's difficult to tell right now, but I do think that it's after seeing what happened in this last election across the country, I do think that there's some definite possibility for some shifts for sure. And in the back.
E-cigarettes and vape cigarettes.
Right. So well, so there is an excise tax on nicotine delivery services like e-cigarettes and vaping pens, and we'll also be working to include that in the tobacco tax that we'll be suggesting this session. So I'm not sure how that will be taken, but that's definitely something that we're including into this tobacco tax, because that's definitely something that's preferred by young people and used at really high rates. So we definitely want to include that. Thank you. Okay, yep.
Is that a big, how much tobacco is grown in Georgia? Is there any grown in Georgia? It's mainly grown in different states, right? In other words, is there a lobby here besides the national tobacco industry that's fighting against that?
There's definitely folks who are not in favor of raising the tobacco tax in Georgia. And I'm not sure if that's just farmers, but that's folks at the legislature, different organizations. So there's definitely pushback on raising the tax for issues that are mostly economic. Is that all the questions? Oh, okay.
Do you know how much money the state of Georgia misses out on for not being fully compliant with Medicaid, like the federal mandates that come with that?
Right. So that number does fluctuate, but it is a 2-to-1 return. So it's putting $1 into the Medicaid program and getting 2 back. So it's double for investment.
I mean, do you think that there are going to be plans for that to shift towards being more compliant, like how Nathan Gill did that with his criminal, all that sort of, the Justice Reform Acts that went forward over the last couple of years? Do you think that the plan will be for that with Medicaid, or what do you think?
I don't think that there's a lot of clean Medicaid expansion bills right now that will be suggested. If there will, I think it would be mostly a waiver program or something of that nature. But that also sometimes includes work requirements and other issues that impact consumers. So I don't believe that there's going to be some clean Medicaid expansion stuff out there. Yeah. Does that conclude questions? Okay. Oh, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Alyssa. That's a lot of money we're leaving on the table, isn't it? Next, I would like to introduce Helen Robinson with the YWCA. She's the Director of Advocacy at the YWCA of Greater Atlanta. She mobilizes diverse groups of women leaders to advocate for policy solutions to improve the health and safety and the economic empowerment of women and girls in Georgia. She's also a lead trainer for the Georgia Women's Policy Institute, and we're very happy to have you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me here. Again, I'm with the YWCA of Greater Atlanta. We work on state-level policy that impacts the health and safety and the economic empowerment of women and girls. And I am happy to bring good news to you this evening that we are going to be welcoming 15 new women legislators into the Georgia General Assembly in 2019. 2 senators and 13 representatives. And so our recent election has improved gender parity in our state legislature, which we need to keep doing. With these 15 new women, we will be increasing the percentage of women legislators in the Georgia General Assembly from 27% to 31%. So that is significant. And it is really important, I think, to point out that while not very many state legislative seats are competitive every election cycle, in all of the ones that were competitive in this November election, 2/3 of those races had a woman, either as a challenger, the incumbent, or both. So if we can keep up those kind of numbers and keep encouraging women to run, we will most definitely reach the correct percentage of women in the Georgia General Assembly, which is 51. Thank you. We are on our way. So thank a woman who ran. If you see one, even if she didn't win, thank her and encourage her because we are definitely moving in the right direction. It was mentioned that one of the things that I do at the YWCA is I run the Georgia Women's Policy Institute. And there are a couple of fellows, current and alumni from that program in the room tonight. And it is my favorite thing about my job. But what we do is we do intensive training for an entire year to get women from all backgrounds, all professional backgrounds, all ages, all different educational backgrounds, to know the ins and outs of how to go down to the state capitol and work on a proactive bill that will impact the lives of women and girls. And I'm going to let you know what our projects are for 2019. We have a team that's going to be working on the issue of the discipline of physicians who sexually abuse their patients. Unfortunately, this has been sickeningly in the news a lot, both on the national level and also here in our state. There have been many pretty severe cases. And so we are working to come up with some proactive solutions to help make sure that our discipline process here in our state actually works and prevents further abuse of victims. And one simple example of that is to require criminal background checks of doctors when they come to be licensed in Georgia. We are one of only, I think it's around 6 states in the country that don't require criminal background checks for our licensure process here. Another team is going to be working to protect young people in the criminal justice system by helping make sure that they are not indiscriminately shackled during court hearings, to ensure that they are not experiencing trauma during that process that will help prevent them from the rehabilitation that we want them to achieve through the juvenile justice system. And our third team, I'm excited to say, is going to be working on equal pay. I've been waiting for a team to pick that issue. It's a tough one in our environment for sure, but we're going to just be looking at some very simple, common sense best practices, like, for example, having employers follow a rule of not asking what you made in your last job when you're being interviewed. Because when women are asked that question and they answer it honestly, then they get caught in a cycle and they can never make up the gap in their pay. We also work collaboratively, as every other speaker has said. We work in coalition with other organizations on issues. A couple that have not been mentioned yet is there is a coalition working on this concept of, it's called menstrual equity, but the idea of making sure that women and girls of all income levels have access to the menstrual products, the feminine hygiene products that they need, whether they are incarcerated, whether they're girls going to school. And that can look like, that can take on a number of different angles, so we will see what that looks like during the session. We've also been part of a coalition for a couple of years now working for a Georgia work credit. This is a state-level version of the federal earned income tax credit, and it would just put a little bit of extra money in the pockets of working women when they file their taxes by giving them a credit off of their state income tax. And we know that when women get that little bit of extra money, it can make a huge difference when they are trying to go up the ladder and escape poverty. We also are working with multiple organizations on a bill that was introduced last session that is going to come back to provide reasonable accommodations for pregnant workers in Georgia. So this can mean taking a bathroom break when you need to, having water breaks, being able to sit down if you have a job that requires you to stand. And last but not least, we work with multiple organizations on increasing state funding for child care subsidies, which are called, we call it CAPS, the CAPS program here in Georgia. And unfortunately, we have a lot of families that are not being served by that program. So any effort to get more into that funding line in the budget is really important to women and families in our state. The last thing I wanted to say to you all is that we also, after the end of a session, work to implement bills that were passed. And so in the last session, in the 2018 state legislative session, we helped with House Bill 834, which was an important bill that will allow domestic violence survivors to terminate a private rental lease if they need to relocate for safety. And so the Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation worked with us on that, and I brought a few copies of a brochure that they've created so that if you work with survivors or you know anyone who does, you can make sure that they know about this right that they have. If we don't spread the word about it, it's not effective as a bill. And so I have a couple of copies if anyone wants to see me after this event. And last but not least, please remember to vote in the runoff. So we thought we were done. There's an election on December 4th. No matter what happens with the governor's race, there's going to be a runoff election. Women vote. We are super voters. Let's keep that up. It never ends. Elections never end. So just keep voting and come down to the state capitol in January to see all of us and engage in one or more of these issues that I talked about today. Thank you.
Do you do a lobby day where you have people who aren't involved in the program?
Yes, and we don't have a date for that, but we are planning to do a women's lobby day, which could cross over any number of the issues that any of us have talked about tonight. We're going to see what's moving and host a lobby day. So I will be sure to get you that information to share. Yes, I'd love for you to come. Yes.
Get all information on, especially the pregnancy accommodation
Absolutely.
equal pay legislation that you end up putting forward or finding a sponsor for. We would love to hear and know more about that.
Thank you. Excellent. Megan?
This is a super wonky question, so you might not know the answer. But if anyone knows, you would. So even though like the goal is to get to a point where we have a General Assembly that reflects the like gender ratios of our state, which is 51% women, sort of 51% of the population, research has also found that there's a percentage where women hit a critical mass in like any sort of body, and where you start to see changes that benefit women and families anyway. I don't remember what that number is to you, because I think it might be 30%.
I hope it is 30%. Let's go with that. No, I'll check that. I don't know the number, but I know the research that you're talking about. And yes, you do have to have a critical mass of women just so that they can feel the sense of empowerment to be able to speak up on the issues that they care about. You know, research also shows that when you have women elected officials, they do spend more time and effort on constituent services, on things that are important to their district, and on issues that impact families and children. But again, until you reach that critical mass, they don't have the voice to make that happen. So let's say 30%, and 2019 is going to be the year for that. And all of us will support all of these new women and our incumbent women as well. I think it was really well said. They have a hard job to do in addition to their other job. And so it's just important to make them feel supported so that they keep at it and can be a strong collective voice. Thank you.
Next, we have a new organization for this event. We have a few people who are coming up. I'm going to introduce Linda Bressler, who is with AAACTS. She's the founder and co-chair of this social action committee of the Achim Synagogue. I'm going to let you take over.
Okay,
It seems like you've got this.
Hopefully, yes. Thank you. Thank you for inviting us. The fact that it is the first time that this important issue is being presented before you tells a lot of where we are. I'm Linda Bressler. I'm co-chair with Margie Eden of AAACTS. And we have been a social action committee of the Ahavath Achim Synagogue. And our mission is to eradicate domestic minor sex trafficking through awareness, action, and advocacy. And in the last 5 years from when we started, we have seen tremendous growth of awareness and much stronger Georgia laws on this issue. Before our professional talks to you, I want to just give you a few statistics so you'll understand the magnitude of what we're talking about. Nationally, 100 to 300,000 children are at risk of being victimized by DMST. The average age of entry into the commercial sex market for children is between 12 and 14 years old. And there have been rescues of children as young as 9 and 5. 1 in 6 reported endangered runaways are believed to be victims of child sex trafficking. And because we have such a huge number of kids in our foster care system here in Georgia, that translates into so many kids who become runaways, and they are particularly vulnerable to being trafficked. The size of the commercial sex economy in major U.S. cities ranges from an estimated 40 million to 190 million per year. It is a business only surpassed by gun sales. It used to be drug sales, but once drugs are sold and used, that's the end of it. Children are sold and used and used and used. And 63% of DMST victims are being sold online. In Georgia, the statistics, as if it's not bad enough to hear the national, in our own state, between 200 and 350 adolescents are sold online per month. And 65% of the men who purchase sex with children live in the Atlanta suburban areas outside of the perimeter. And the statistic says sex with female children, we're also seeing that boys are now being trafficked also. And 7,200 men purchase sex from a minor every month in Georgia, accounting for 87 sex acts. And the sex traffickers, again, it's a business, it's strictly a business to them, make an average of $32,000 per week. 91% of DMST victims in Georgia were enrolled in school at the time of their exploitation.
Thank you, Linda. I'm Margie Eden, and the co-chair of AAX, and we have brought a professional tonight to talk to you about the upcoming legislation, and I would like to introduce Kamala. Kamala Wright Zalfargari, did I say that good? Kamala brings more than a decade of experience prosecuting human trafficking cases and advocating for the legislative changes in Georgia and throughout the U.S. Her previous works include being appointed by Georgia's former Attorney General, Sam Olens, as the first chief prosecutor dedicated to the prosecution of human trafficking. While overseeing the Attorney General's policy agenda on human trafficking, she also led trainings for law enforcement and prosecutors at the state and national level. Prior to that, she led the Human Trafficking Unit for the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, where she was responsible for the prosecution of all cases related to human trafficking and commercial exploitation of children. Kamala obtained her Juris Doctorate from the University of North Carolina and her LLM International Law from the University of Amsterdam. Kamala.
Thank you so much.
And I would like to mention that Kamala is with Street Grace, and this is one of the nonprofits that we partner with.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm going to try to pull this up so I can run through the slides. Thank you so much for having me here. A lot of you and a lot of your organizations have really partnered, of course, Helen, on the human trafficking legislation over the years. And human trafficking legislation, we really have taken the approach over the last 10 years of we're not going to try to hit a home run. We're going to try to move down the field. So a lot of this legislation you'll see is just an increase on stuff we've already done. So some of our legislative priorities for this year, and some of these are already being worked on by legislators. Everyone who has carried a human trafficking bill in the past on any side was reelected. So we've got a lot of new friends and partners, but we also have a lot of old friends and partners who are returning. We want to make sure we criminalize those who illegally profit from human trafficking. This not only includes the pimps or the friends or the boyfriends, but also the hotels and the hotel owners. There's a big push this year in the legislature to make sure we are holding the corporations and hotels that are benefiting accountable. Also, we would like to make the hotel employees mandatory reporters, be required to report suspected child abuse, runaway children, and human trafficking. And I've got a very clear picture of what this means of two cases, one we did in Fulton, both that I did in Fulton County. Two 14-year-olds ran away from a group home. They were there because they had been abused. They were, law enforcement was looking for one of these girls, had missing person flyers out. She got to a hotel clerk recognized her. They were both recovered. Her two pimps were arrested, prosecuted, are in jail and gone. Two 14-year-olds and a 12-year-old get recruited by a trafficker in the neighborhood. takes them to a hotel, starts to sell them. Police start looking for them. Police come to the hotel looking for them. The hotel staff tells these girls, we know you're runaways. We know you're being prostituted. You need to leave here because we don't want any trouble. Their pimp wasn't arrested for 3 years. It's very important. These are very key people. We want to make sure we have a lot of hotel staff that is so helpful and important in this issue. We want to make sure that we encourage that, but we also want to make sure that the bad actors have to act and are held accountable. So we also want to make sure Georgia can give harsh penalties to any registered sex offender who pimps, panders, or is found in a hotel room with a minor. We find this all the time in our investigations of trafficked victims, that they at some point we will recover them and they'll be in a hotel room with a registered sex offender, somebody already convicted on the list you would look at online. But if they're not actively being supervised, which means maybe they've already served 10 or 15 years in jail for what they did, there is absolutely no additional penalty. There's nothing we can do on the state level to penalize them for being back in the trafficking world as a registered sex offender. There's something they can do at the federal level, but there's nothing we can do at the state level. And as we know, the feds have very limited resources and only pick the cream of the crop cases, and most of our victims fall to our district attorney's offices to find justice for. So we want to also continue to ensure human trafficking victims are treated like victims, not criminals, that they're protected, supported, and giving the resources they need to recover. A lot of that was done in the Safe Harbor Act, but all of that money is being held up by a judge in Fulton County, and we knew that that litigation was coming when we drafted it. We drafted it according to good federal law. So I think we'll get that money eventually, but we still have a great need for resources. And as I was talking to the Barton Clinic earlier, in some of our hearings, we've heard a great interest on both sides of the aisle, possibly even addressing this in appropriations and providing some state money for services for these victims this year. So we'll see how far that goes, but there was really some broad interest in that, while the money that should be coming from our adult establishments is going to be held up in court for a while. But also we have, in Georgia, you can still charge a child with prostitution. We are actually becoming one of the few states where that's still a thing. We say in Georgia, a child under 16 cannot consent to sex. A child under 18 cannot consent to commercial sex, but we still are charging them with prostitution. We've done a great job educating our law enforcement that is not the way to go, educating DFACs, that's not the policy to follow. And generally in the metro Atlanta area, we've been really fortunate to have been able to do that just through education, but there's still girls in middle and southern Georgia who are being charged as 14-year-olds with prostitution and not treated like the victims that they truly are. So we're going to continue. We've gotten that as far as there's an affirmative defense if the girl was experiencing force, fraud, or coercion. But affirmative defense, as you know, is not a non-criminalization. We're being careful not to say decriminalization, because then we get an attacks from sides you don't even expect. So the penalty for pimping and pandering should be a felony. We need to send the message that this is taken seriously. We've actually got this legislation through the House. We've got it through the Senate. And it gets back to the House made a little stronger, and it all falls apart. We've gotten it through twice now, but not all the way to the end. So we're going to try to keep running with this, because it doesn't matter if you are buying an adult. She almost certainly, in every situation, was originally a child trafficking victim. You are exploiting her need for something, and your pimping is by definition controlling. And it feeds, and the pandering, the purchasing, that is what feeds and fuels the trafficking of our children. And then finally, Georgia needs to criminalize sex tourism, which basically includes knowingly selling or offering to sell travel services to include or facilitate human trafficking. This is a federal law. It's a law in a lot of states. It's just kind of a hole in Georgia. We haven't had a ton of cases, but definitely as speaking to law enforcement, there have been several starts of investigation and then realized this isn't a crime here. So hopefully this will be the type that, okay, everybody can get on board with and pass. But this is basically what we're looking at for this year. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
I thought it was great when you were talking about kind of the initiatives with hotel employees. Is there problems with Airbnb and VRBO and that kind of thing being used as, places that maybe pimps or different folks are renting out to do these kind of sex acts, and how do we combat that?
That is. So the question is in regards to the hotels, but what about the Airbnbs and what are we seeing with Airbnb and VRBO? That's actually one of our initiatives around the Super Bowl, is training to those owners of what to look for and what to do and what to report. I do think would be a great idea. That's what we're partnering with the Attorney General to do right now, is get them trained and get them up to speed on what they're looking for. And then if we do end up, because we are having some cases originate from there, and if that becomes something we start to see more frequently, then we may want to add them to this legislation as well, for sure. Yes.
Segues really well to my question, which is about the Super Bowl.
Yes.
Of course, we know when you have a huge event like that, bringing a lot of folks in from out of town, you see a spike in buying of trafficking victims. So,
right.
What are you doing about that? Is there anything that we as normal humans can do to help, other than if we're not seeing someone obviously
Right. So the question is, what are we doing about the Super Bowl? There's really a lot going on, a lot of coordinated efforts being done around the Super Bowl. What we're doing with the Attorney General's office is training transportation. That includes working with everything from UPS to Uber and Lyft and the Truckers Association, and then the Hotel Lodging Motel Association. A lot of it is just being trained to see something. One of the statistics shows about 22% of cases that originated in a hotel room were actually reported by a victim. The rest of them were reported either by staff or by other people in the hotels. It really makes a difference. I always encourage, especially if you've been at all trained to identify what trafficking might look like, that when you call 911, if it's something happening immediately, you have to call 911. Those hotline numbers are great to initiate investigations, but doesn't immediately get to the officers who need to. But when you call 911, go ahead and drop the words human trafficking in there, so that will be fed to the patrol officer and start to raise some flags. Let them know what it is you're concerned about, and that can really get an officer who's just running everywhere flagged. Also around the Super Bowl, APD will have a number set up that a lot of the nonprofits that do more of the street work will have to call, and anything that looks like human trafficking will be fed through that human trafficking team and number. Lots. Yes.
Back up your question.
Repeat it.
AAX, we are working with the Episcopal Diocese on a program called SOAP, S-O-A-P, Stop Our Adolescent Prostitution. And this is a national organization. We will be training a couple of hundred volunteers to go into the hospitality industry, to the hotels, the motels, with 20,000 bars of soap that are labeled with the hotline number if you're being trafficked, if you know something like. So I'll send
With
that
educational materials.
So that's something hopefully we can get you to send out. And we're definitely looking for volunteers from everybody's different group to come and help with that.
Yes, that's excellent.
In answer to your question, the International Human Trafficking Institute started about 9 months ago.
Yes.
And put together a coalition of about 300 people, which includes state government, local government, nonprofits, faith community, and they have a huge education outreach. The outreach that Kamala did with the what were you just talking?
Oh, the transportation.
Was part of that.
Yes.
Outreach with the lift flag
Yes.
and all that.
And they're doing Train the Trainers at the Human Rights Institute. That's Deborah Richardson. And so they're doing great stuff, very focused on the Super Bowl. Yes.
So this is not necessarily about legislation,
Right.
but I am always hesitant to call 911, especially in this day and age of
Yeah.
crazy people calling 911 on totally innocent people of color. Where would I find resources to know what I'm looking for? I travel a great deal. for
Right.
work, so I'm always in airports and hotels. Where can I go to find information on what I'm actually looking for, so I know, hey, when do I actually call 911 and when am I being
Yeah.
terrible?
So that is an excellent point. Really, the question was, how do I find resources for what really are red flags and what might be some of our biases? We have some online at streetgrace.org. There are some at the Attorney General's office. It's a lot of the training that we do with GBI. A lot of those red flags have to do with, I could go through the red flags, but this is about legislation. But that is actually a lot of, I think, some of the more important training. I think GBI's training that we do is really good because a lot of times you're not, which we try to stress, you're not just looking for people of mixed color. I come from a very mixed color family of adoptions and everything. You're not looking for that, but you could be looking for an older man with younger girls who aren't dressed appropriately for the weather. One really big one is if somebody else has her ID, that's a red flag. Anything that looks like it exerts control. If she won't answer the question without looking at him or somebody else, and I shouldn't actually even use these stereotypes. We have female pimps as well. Most majority are men, but we have female pimps so often because they've been so exploited and we're not recovered. But if somebody else, it's more of that control effort because, yes, we all saw that in Cobb County where the poor babysitter was called, so that's, you're looking for some fear, you're looking for some control. And yes, and sometimes you're going to have to err on the side of maybe she's, maybe it's her father and she's acting out and there's, for the sake of saving, but you don't just want to call every time you see that. So it's actually a really good question. Something we've been discussing a lot is to get those red flags, but the lists are very important. One big one is the lack of eye contact. It's one of the biggest, most consistent rules in trafficking is you don't make eye contact with another person of authority or else you belong to that person as your pimp. So when my girls say, he had a bunch of guys around, but I don't know what they look like, they were actually probably not protecting them. They really didn't make eye contact. As I make contact with her, I know belong to her. And so the lack of eye contact is one of the more consistent things we see. But obviously, teenagers don't make eye contact. You can't make a call just on that. But it's the control and the fear is when we really start to think there's a real red flag going on. So anything else? Definitely, if you sign up for our newsletter, we'll start pushing this out as things actually get dropped. And I appreciate all you do. And definitely, I agree with basically everything Georgia Trial Association said about what we're looking at this year. And if you're a lawyer, please help your legislature because so often we get something back from legislative services and the law says exactly the opposite of what the member wanted it to say and they don't get it. So thank you for what you do.
Thank you all so much, Linda and Margie and Kamala. That was very informative and gives me some great ideas of some volunteer opportunities in the new year. I'm sorry we're running a little bit over, but we are getting towards the end. Next, we have Susanna Scott, who is with the League of Women Voters. And I'm not sure if the league has come and spoke to us before, but it's been a minute. Susanna is an attorney with Iron Mountain Intellectual Property Management. She graduated from Mount Holyoke College and Georgia State University College of Law. She's also a graduate of Trinity College Dublin's LLM program. She's been a member of the League of Women Voters for over 10 years, serving as a member of the voter guide and communications committees on the local and state league levels. She's currently serving as the chair of the League DeKalb and as the director of the league's director on the board of the Georgia League.
Thank you. And Camille. All right, and trying to find the play button, which should be really easy. It usually is, and I just can't see it because it's right there. Yep. Right there. Yep. Thank you. There we go. Maybe. Yep. So, thank you. So, again, I'm Susanna Scott, and I'm with the League of Women Voters of Georgia. We were founded in 1920 by Carrie Chapman Catt, right before the 19th Amendment passed and was ratified. For nearly 100 years, the League has been defending democracy by empowering voters. And our goal is, actually, we want to make sure that every voter is given the knowledge and the power and the information so that they can make good voting decisions and go out and be active members of the political arena. So we don't support or oppose candidates or parties. We are here for the voters. And my phone is doing crazy things. So I'm here. We're here to talk about our current legislative priority for the next 2 years is redistricting, gerrymandering. Nearly 4 million voters cast a vote in Georgia this year, which is excellent. It's about 61%, I believe, which is great for a midterm. And there are some surprising outcomes from that. We're seeing the difference that 10 years of demographic change coupled with energized voting population makes in districts that have been carefully constructed to produce a particular outcome. So the gerrymandering. We are here to discuss the the redistricting process here in Georgia. In 1789, when the Constitution was ratified, the House of Representatives consisted of 65 members, each representing about 30,000 people. As the country and its population expanded, so did the House of Representatives until 1920, when they sort of said, we're not getting any bigger. So as a result, the current ratio of constituents to representatives is 750,000 people, and that's in the most populous districts. The Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of Georgia established a process by which the current 435 representatives are apportioned among the states and assigned to districts. The step one is we conduct a census of the population at least once every 10 years. Step two, Congress apportions representatives to the states based on the population, and the state legislatures do the same for their legislative districts. Step three, the legislatures of the various states divide their states into districts based on those apportionments. So founders did a great job in a lot of aspects, but one thing they didn't do well was figuring out who was going to handle that whole reapportionment process. They basically put the fox in charge of the hen house. And so, we're on slide 4. Legislatures have not performed this task with a view to fair and effective representation of their constituents. Legislatures are almost incapable of drawing districts in an open and transparent manner, and it has been incredibly difficult for either voters or the courts to hold them accountable. The goal of reforming the process is to ensure fair and effective representation at all levels of government through a process that includes enforceable standards and maximizes the opportunity for the public to participate. Redistricting reform seeks to do two things: get the fox out of the hen house and or control what the fox is doing in the hen house, and always to ensure that the public knows what's going on. So how fair and effective representation is defined, and what do we mean by a transparent process with enforceable standards? There's 3 tiers of consideration. The first is constitutional. The U.S. Constitution says that districts must be equal in population, which has been interpreted to mean one person, one vote. The Constitution protects the voting rights of certain identifiable and historically underrepresented groups, specifically racial and language minorities. And the Georgia Constitution only requires that districts must be contiguous, which means you can't split a district into 2 separate areas, which sometimes people have tried to do. The second tier of consideration can be imposed on the mapping body by law. Partisan fairness, which has been interpreted recently as forbidding considering voting patterns of the constituents. Communities of interest, which are defined by socioeconomic, ethnic, geographic, and economic or other interests, and existing political subdivisions or boundaries. And the final tier of consideration are the ones that we are most often hear about. Compactness, which addresses the classic gerrymander coined in 1812, and when a district in Massachusetts looked a lot like a salamander. And competitiveness, which is defined by districts where one or more party has a realistic chance of winning the elections. And you would have heard about, we want the best way to have, an actual fair election or, or truly representative government is where they actually have to listen to the most number of people. So the more likely it's competitive, the better that is. And no matter what the technique, the legislatures inevitably restrict access to the public that the public has to the process. So they like to have public hearings with no maps for the public to look at, hearings at inconvenient times and places. Here in Georgia, they especially like to change the location and the time at the last minute. And hearings presided over by legislators who have no authority to draw the maps. And they keep the computer algorithms secret. Because in this day and age, it's mostly done by computer algorithms, not by people sitting there with the map going block by block. So how do we reform the process? The states that have successfully reformed redistricting have taken the fox out of the henhouse altogether by creating independent, nonpartisan, or bipartisan commissions to draw the maps. States like Florida have imposed on their legislature the same criteria that would apply to an independent commission. Whether redistricting is done by an independent commission or by the legislature, the vote on the final map should be by a supermajority. Public participation should be maximized by imposing a schedule on the redistricting body that requires the maps to be drawn and available for public comment, by a certain time, as well as requiring that the criteria used to draw the maps is open source and available to the public. Finally, standards must be enforceable, and a process for automatic count review should be included. So how do we do that in Georgia? Ideally, we'd amend the Constitution. But unlike states like Florida and California and Colorado, that has to go through the legislature first. It can't just be done by people saying we want to put this on the ballots. So we sort of have to go through the legislature to make those changes. We're at the start of the the legislative biennium. There is a draft bill that calls for an independent commission, enforceable standards, and transparency. All the reforms discussed here are included in that legislation. We're waiting for the smoke to clear from this election. And once that's done, we're hopefully going to find a sponsor for that legislation. We've had people like Senator Elena Parent have had redistricting legislation in the past, so we're hoping we can get someone to pick it up. Once the bill is filed, we will be paying attention to the new legislative leadership. Public pressure on the leadership and legislators in majority party districts will be critical to the effort. We have 2 years to get this passed in order to impact the process after the 2020 census. Remember that this is a bipartisan problem. So long as the party out of power is laying in wait, waiting for their chance to stick it to the other side, we voters are going to be the losers. So it's not about defeating the Republicans and electing Democrats. It's about the voters and the constituents. One key element of the legislation we are supporting is that it forbids mapping authorities from considering voting parties or voting patterns and histories. Our strategy to get the fox out of the hen house is to tell the fox what to do and what not to do while they're in the hen house, and to finally make sure that we know what they're doing when they are in the hen house. So after all, we should be choosing them, and they should not be choosing us. So, any questions? I will say we haven't gone live yet, but we are coming out with a petition that we're going to be making public. We are hoping through the use of the petition to get contact details for people so that we can give them updates during the legislative session. Once we know who the leadership is, we want to be able to call on people who are in those leaders' districts to reach out to them and really push them to consider letting legislation move to the floor. They're resistant to do that. And again, it's both parties, I think Megan's mentioned. So we hope that you'll help spread the word and make sure that people know that they need to let their legislators know how they feel about redistricting. So, anything else? All right, thank you.
Thank you. That's a really, really timely and important topic. Our last speaker is Caitlin Barnes from the Barton Child Law and Policy Center. She is a postgraduate fellow supporting the policy research and advocacy activities of the Barton Center, whose mission is to protect the rights and interests of court-involved children in Georgia and promote improvements to the systems that serve those children. She also assists in the supervision and education of graduate students participating in the legal clinics. Thank you.
All right. And then do I move that way? Yes. Okay. Great. So I'll skip over our mission because you just heard about it and we're running over already. Thank you so much for having me tonight. This has been a really great conversation as we're all sort of still recovering from the election and gearing up for session. I also won't get into how sort of weird and wonky and unique this session is going to be. We've heard a lot about that, and I think that's one thing that we can all agree on. We'll just have to wait and see what it looks like once we get there. But I will go through a couple of legislative items that the Barton Center will be working on this session, that we're planning to work on this session. One, the first is a leftover issue from last session, and this is an update to the child maltreatment definitions in Georgia. So just really quickly, the definition that's used in the mandated reporter statute is different from the definition that is used in the juvenile code, and a few important ways that's led to some procedural issues over the years. So we're really just looking to align what's in the mandated reporter statute with what's in the juvenile code to make things a little bit easier for DFACs and the juvenile courts and reporters and all sorts of other folks. There's also some, it's a little bit outdated. There are some new trends in how we define and how other states define child abuse. So we're going to be updating it to align it with the states around us and some of those trends and making sure that we're sort of capturing child abuse as it's happening now and as it has changed. So that's one piece. This feeds into the next issue, which is a lot bigger and has been years of work and will continue, and that's the Child Abuse Registry. For those of you who are not familiar with this was created about 2.5 years ago now. It's kind of like the Sex Offender Registry, but a little bit different in some important ways. So this is a database of people who have allegedly perpetrated child abuse or neglect on kids. And so these are folks who have been investigated by DFACS, and DFACS, an investigator has substantiated the case against them, which substantiation means that they have found preponderance of the evidence that this person perpetrated child abuse or neglect. So once that happens, their name goes on the registry. They're on there for life, unless they can initially prove that they did not commit child abuse. So even if many years down the line they've rehabilitated themselves, there have been no other incidents of child abuse, they still can't come off the registry. So the registry is sort of aims to protect children and help state agencies and child serving agencies protect children, so that so the folks who, unlike the sex offender registry, this is not open to the public, so you can't go on and check if your neighbor is on this registry. But importantly, it is used by employment and licensing agencies, and so can get in the way of people's careers and sort of keep them out of careers. And that can be important for severe abusers and severe perpetrators, but the registry doesn't distinguish between those folks who have committed severe acts of child abuse or neglect versus those that are less severe. So this, again, was created about 2.5 years ago. Since its implementation, it has created a lot of problems for virtually every stakeholder group that has to deal with it. And so we are looking to Barton and a few other members and a sort of an informal coalition are working to draft a sort of big bill to plug some holes and address some of those issues. A couple of things that I'll just highlight for you. One, there's some real due process concerns with how it's drafted now, that folks on that, as I've already mentioned, once you're on it, you can never come off, even if you have rehabilitated yourself in some way, and you don't get a chance to appeal. There's no hearing on your placement on the registry until after you've been placed on the registry. So after those liberty interests have already sort of been triggered, and only then can you have a hearing and test to see if you actually should be on it. So there's some serious due process concerns, and again, just a lot of procedural things that get in the way of the prosecution of severe cases of child abuse and DFACS work and all sorts of stuff. So we'll be working on that. You'll hear more about that. We were waiting to see, there were a couple of cases moving through the courts challenging the constitutionality of the registry. And so we're sort of waiting to see how those came down before we tried to do a big legislative overhaul. And those came down this year, and the court, as it is wont to do, ignored all of the important questions and sort of, didn't decide on the merits. So we've got to do something about it. So that'll be coming this year. And a couple of big things I wanted to alert you to. The first one is what I'll spend most of my time on for the remainder of my time really quickly, and that's this Family First Prevention Services Act. This is a big overhaul to federal child welfare law that was passed almost overnight back in February as part of the president's budget. And a lot of folks consider it to be one of the biggest changes in federal child welfare law since 1980. So this is a really big deal. I'll just very quickly, it really shifts the focus, and by shifting funding to prevention and keeping children out of foster care, and if they have to come into care, making sure that they are in family foster care settings and not child care institutions unless they actually belong there. So it's really about sort of shifting focus to prevention and to families, as you can tell from the title, which is good. So this is going to be a years-long process of bringing Georgia into compliance with this law. A lot of federal dollars, a lot of new federal dollars, which is exciting, but a lot of federal dollars that are at stake. So we'll probably have a couple of pieces of legislation coming out this session to start getting us into compliance with this law, but it's going to be a years-long process. So I just want to sort of put that on your table to get you thinking about that. And then the Indian Child Welfare Act is an old law that Georgia needs to update its statutes to come into compliance with. So this is just about making sure that the child welfare system is treating Native American children and their families fairly. And so there's sort of special rules that apply to them, and we'll be bringing that into Georgia code. And that is all I have for you. So any questions? Try to be super quick in the back.
When kids from going into foster care, is there any thoughts of legislation give more financial support for grandparents or family members raising, taking
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, the question was okay, got it. Never mind. A couple of things to answer that. The first is when they're talking about prevention services, what's outlined in the bill is actually fairly specific kinds of services that are going to be funded at first. So it's mental health services and supports for families and in-home parenting skills courses and programs and substance abuse treatment. So it's fairly specific. It's about giving services to families so that their children can remain with them safely and they can sort of improve their situation without having to take that child into foster care. So not in that piece is there anything about kin in particular. I will say that there is a lot of work being done at the federal level and here in Georgia to bring kin caregivers up to parity with sort of stranger foster caregivers or stranger foster families. Those are foster families who are not related to the child by blood or marriage. And so those are a really, really great resource. We know that we've got about 15,000 kids in foster care in Georgia today, which is a really, really high number. And so those kin caregivers, those families, those grandparents especially, are a really important resource. And there's a lot of work being done to make sure that they are well supported and as supported as other foster families. Any other questions? Thanks y'all so much.
So that concludes our program for tonight. I want to say a really big thank you to all of our speakers for coming out, for hanging in with us. We've got some lovely parting gifts. And I'd like to say thank you to Veritext for connecting us with our chapters and people who could not be here in person. And finally, and almost most importantly, I'd like to thank Troutman Sanders for their continued support of this event. It's I had somebody else tell me it's one of their favorite events. It's one of my favorite events. I look forward to it every year. And drive safely on the way home. Thank you.